Hi, this is Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, with Sheldon Richmond, the foundation's vice president. This is the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on the burning issues of the day, the perspective that you're certainly not going to get on the mainstream media, and certainly not today, because we're going to have a free-for-all today. I told Sheldon, I said, let's do a free-for-all where we talk about just major differences between libertarians on the one side and conservatives and liberals on the other. And liberals, I mean, of course, in the corrupted sense of the term, the modern sense of the term, leftists or progressives or whatever. That, especially on conservatives, because, people often think that libertarianism is sort of a branch of conservatism, and nothing could be further from the truth. And Sheldon, the way I see it is that you've got on the one side the libertarians, and on the other side the liberals and conservatives, which I lump together as status. So I thought what we do today is just do a spontaneous session. You throw out some things that you think are different between us and them, and I'll throw out some things, and we'll just interact and talk about the things that we come up with. And so I'll start it out by talking about the welfare state. I mean, here's a classic example of where libertarians are different from both conservatives and liberals. That you've got this massive edifice in America today, where it's the role of the federal government, to a certain extent the state and local governments, but mostly the federal government, to take money from everyone or most groups of people in order to transfer the money to another group of people. So we're talking about Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, aid to dictators, education grants, farm subsidies, food stamps, it's on and on and on. I mean, I would say that's the primary function of the federal government. And conservatives and liberals both believe in this. They believe in this philosophy. It was embodied by the Franklin Roosevelt administration. I mean, I would argue this was the major revolutionary change, the major paradigm shift. And libertarians are totally different. We object to all of these transfer programs. We believe that people have a fundamental right to keep everything they earn and to decide for themselves what to do with it. So we believe, in a sense, in the separation of charity and the state. That is where people are free to decide for themselves whether to care for others, donate to churches, or donate to this worthy cause or whatever. This is the very essence of a free society, being free to decide what to do with your own money. What do you think, Sheldon?
Well, good point. Welfare state, or aid to the poor, relief, it's gone by many names, reaches back, at least as far as Elizabethan England, when there was concern that people who weren't doing what they were expected to do, namely, the peasants weren't working the land or being artisans or somehow in what was recognized as legitimate kind of work, and maybe we're just roaming the country and living, hand to mouth. They were considered a threat, possible threat of civil strife, revolution, whatnot. And so the state began first at a local level, and then more nationally began to provide so-called services, but the main goal was not so much charity, but control, social control. And there's always been a strong element of social control in the welfare state throughout American history. I mean, there were relief sort of activities in the colonies and the early states. The federal government actually gets into the welfare business after the Civil War when it institutes pensions for veterans. But it quickly becomes a great source of favoritism by Congress, because they could grant pensions to people just arbitrarily. And decades after the war, when the veterans had long after when most of the veterans had died off, there were veterans nephews getting congressional grants and as a form of pension. And so politicians got a taste of what it's like to be able to control aid to people, and you can really locate, and a lot of writers, historians have located the beginning of the welfare state in America at the national level in this pension program. So the New Deal really sort of consolidates things that have been going on for a long time. The extraordinary circumstances of the Great Depression, of course, meant there wouldn't be a lot of public objection to the federal government formalizing that kind of relief. But I agree with you. It subordinates liberty. I mean, I wrote a book on this. It tethers us, which is why I called the book Tethered Citizens. And it does create the power and the pretext for the government to control people on the grounds that you're getting aid, and therefore we have a right to control you with drug testing, let's say, or other kinds of burdens imposed as a result of your getting these benefits.
Yeah, I think your point about control is absolutely fantastic because, when you put people on the dole, it really creates this mindset of dependency. And you see it time and time again. I was recently speaking at to a group where a doctor pointed out that he got his education thanks to grants from the federal government, and he told me, he says, I would have never gotten my medical degree if it hadn't been for the federal government, and he really believed it. I mean, they inculcate this notion in you that without this federal assistance, you could never have become what you became. And I think it's also an insidious way to keep people from objecting too strongly to fundamental aspects of what the government's doing, especially when it's doing wrong things. Because, we've seen it like on the Snowden controversy, where the federal government has told foreign states, if you give this guy asylum or you treat him with any kind of decency, we're going to terminate all foreign aid to your country. I mean, that's the implicit threat. We're going to cut you off from the dole. And I think that's a very subtle message to the American people too, is that you have to stay in line here. Don't object too strongly to what we're doing, because you're dependent on our dole. We might cut you off at any particular time if we want to. And people have become so dependent on the welfare state that they honestly think, there'd be people dying in the streets. I could never survive without this subsidy from the state. So I think it's an insidious form of control in the sense of the dependency mindset that they create among people.
Yeah, I think we don't want to be too deterministic about this. I mean, there have been books and studies, and I've heard interviews with people who have done research on this. Many people who go on welfare lose a job, let's say, and go on welfare for a while. They don't want to be there, and they get off it as soon as they can, and they're working 3-4 jobs. And so, I think we need to be careful about modeling this too strictly and act like once. First of all, that people just generally want to be on the dole, and once they're on, that's it for life, and they're afraid of criticizing the government and getting off it. People don't like being on it for the most part. I mean, it isn't the way most people want to live, and they realize that. And they work really hard. I mean, I also like to attack the welfare state by pointing out that so many routes to self-employment and starting a small-scale business are closed off to people, that often the dole might appear to be the only rational choice they have. Zoning laws, occupational licensing, all the things that we talk about all the time, have the greatest effect on lower skilled, less well-educated people. Of course, education being in the hands of the state, that we can also lay that at the doorstep of the politicians. But a lot of people would be forming their own businesses just out of their own homes, small scale, or vendors, or being street vendors, or things like that, or taxi drivers, and would choose that over the dole if there weren't official barriers. And so I think our attack should be on the welfare state, but we should never forget, and we should always couple that with the way government sets people up for welfare, basically, for the dole.
Yeah, and I think we need to keep in mind that the welfare for the rich. I mean, these big agribusinesses that get farm subsidies and so forth. I mean, they want the dole. They're not one of these that say, I can't wait to get off the dole. They fight for the dole. And in a sense, these trade privileges, I mean, that's a form of welfare when people are trying to protect themselves from competition with tariffs and protective devices and so forth. Look what they've done to the elderly. I mean, if you look at the elderly in America in terms of Social Security and Medicare, large percentage of them honestly believe that they would never survive, that they could never, make it. without these two socialistic programs. Well, nonsense. I think what we need to do is recapture the spirit of can-do and self-reliance and voluntary charity that characterized our ancestors who lived without this stuff. I mean, yeah, there were seeds of this being planted in the 1800s, but let's face it, there was no Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, farm subsidies, public schooling. Another example of, and you've written the great book, Separating School and State. I mean, that to me is just a classic welfare program. And I think we need to recapture this sense that what a free market does and what a free people can do. And that's something that conservatives and liberals have just lost sight of. They inculcate this notion that people would never get educated if you had a free market in education. There would never be any voluntary charity because everybody's just evil and selfish and so forth. And that you wouldn't have prosperity because you need the massive government involvement in the economy for prosperity. We libertarians say all this is just false.
Yeah, and another thing we need to stress is mutual aid. There's no need for us to make it look like when we talk about self-reliance, which of course is a virtue, but we don't need to overstress that because human beings are social animals, which means they're never totally self-reliant. The division of labor means you're not making everything. You're concentrating on one thing, one or two things, and then you're going in the marketplace and trading for other people with other people who have concentrated on other things, and so that's embedding you in a web of social cooperation. And mutual aid, which has been studied so well and written about by David Beto, is an old not only American but English and other cultures too practice where people got together in smaller groups rather than social cooperation in the mass sense. They would join specific groups, not just for the camaraderie and the fraternity of it, but for things like pensions and medical coverage and survivor benefits, funeral expenses, things of that nature. Things that are maybe tougher for a person to do on his or her own could be done by banding together and forming a mutual aid association. These were very popular, mostly among lower-income people. I mean, J.P. Morgan didn't need a mutual aid society. They were mainly lower-income people and immigrants. And if back in the 20s or earlier, if blacks weren't allowed to join the white ones, they went and formed their own and had many large, successful mutual aid associations. So mutual aid is extremely important. It's kind of forgotten about when welfare and things of that nature are discussed. But libertarians ought to be the first to be punching away at this issue and reminding people that. When people are left to their own devices, even when they don't have a lot of resources, they can do quite a bit by getting together.
Yeah, that was one of the things I think that de Tocqueville pointed out when he came to the United States to study what was different about this country. And I think these voluntary associations and voluntary groups were some of the things that he pointed to in his great book, Democracy in America. Let me shift gears here a little bit. Go to the drug war. Here's another big example of how we libertarians are different. This thing has gone on for decades now. I can't imagine a greater violation of the principles of freedom, that the fact that the authorities have the power to put somebody in jail for ingesting what they consider as a harmful substance, for engaging in arguably self-destructive behavior. They can actually barge down his door, seize his drugs, confiscate his house, and put him in jail for 10, 20, 30 years, maybe the rest of his life, is absolutely appalling to a libertarian. And so, to me, this is one of the major demarcation points. Not to forget to point out the racist aspects of the war on drugs. I mean, we all see that this war is falling disproportionately on blacks and Hispanics and so forth. And this is a war that both Democrats and Republicans believe in. They've waged it for years, despite its manifest failure and destructiveness. We libertarians would say, legalize it, get rid of it, just like we got rid of prohibition, because that's the only way that's going to restore a sense of peace and prosperity and harmony among people, not to mention of putting the drug lords out of business.
I agree. And the other day I took note that when Obama was making his impromptu brief speech about the verdict in the George Zimmerman, Trayvon Martin case, he pointed out in talking about how black males, have a more difficult time of it in the U.S. than other people. He mentioned the drug war as an example of a disparity. And yet, he didn't call for repeal of the war on drugs. So I was wondering, I put it up on Facebook, I said, is his ideal of racial justice that whites be as severely persecuted by the war on drugs as blacks? Is that what he means by racial justice? He wants to, I guess, raise enforcement on whites to make it even. I want to lower enforcement on both, all the way down to zero. And so that does show you how this is not just a conservative. I mean, they're real gung ho on the drug war, but it's not just a conservative or Republican thing. The Democrats and so-called liberals and progressives, with some exceptions, are as bad or worse, and they just don't get it. But of course, there's a lot of people making money on it. A lot of people will say the drug war is a failure, but that depends on what you think the objective is. I think it's a rousing success from the point of view of the people that want the drug war, the policymakers, the people, the courts, the police, the drug rehab industry. They're making bundles of money because they have all these people to process and handle. It's a huge success. So they don't know what you're talking about when you tell them it's a failure.
Yeah, well, let's talk about the bribes, too. I mean, there's a lot of people making bribes off this thing. We kind of look down our noses at, the regimes in Latin America that are on the take and so forth. Same thing goes on in this country. I mean, you can't tell me that those drugs are crossing the border just willy-nilly. I mean, they're paying off law enforcement agencies down there, judges, prosecutors. It's a corrupting influence, this whole war on drugs, and the fact that these statists can still support this thing after so many years. And when you combine this with what you were saying earlier about how the regulatory state, the occupational licensure, the minimum wage laws and all this stuff fall very heavily on people in the inner cities, blacks, and you combine it with this racist war that really removes blacks from communities in order to put them in prisons and penitentiaries and take away their right to vote. It really is an insidious machine. Let me throw out another one here. How about the war on immigrants, Sheldon?
Well, another great illustration. I mean, let's start with the conservatives for a second. They claim to be in favor of free markets, free enterprise, private enterprise, and yet they think the government should get between a business person and a prospective employee. Why? Because the employee doesn't have government papers. It shows you what the conservatives' priorities are. If they actually believe in economic freedom, they wouldn't want immigration law to interfere with it, and yet they want harsh penalties on businesses that hire people who don't have government papers. That seems, I won't say it's strange, because we know what their real interest is. Their interest is in a strong nation state, not individual liberty, and a powerful government and an empire. So of course they take this position.
Yeah, and on the liberal side, they're always talking about how much they love the poor, needy, and disadvantaged, and that's how they justify their support of the welfare state. That whenever we libertarians, would call for the repeal of the welfare state, they accuse us, you must hate the poor and the needy and the disadvantaged and so forth. And then when you turn to what the liberals have done in the war on immigrants, it's absolutely, it's hilarious but sad at the same time, because these are the poorest people you'd ever find. I don't think you'd find poorer people in American society than illegal immigrants. And you've got this long time war that Democrats and Republicans have waged, putting people in jail for what they consider this horrendous crime of crossing the border to better their lives, through good, hard work, labor. There's a reason why American employers love to hire immigrants. They know how hardworking they are. They have a strong work ethic. And your point about the hypocrisy of the conservatives is great. They talk about free enterprise, private property, and limited government. That's their favorite little mantra. Well, all immigrants want to do is enter into economic transactions with American employers. It's all they want to do. They just want to get a job with someone that wants to hire them. I mean, what better example could you have of free market activity or free enterprise activity or private property? I mean, the business belongs to the owner. Why shouldn't he be able to use his own money to hire whomever he wants? And here you got conservatives supporting raids on private businesses and a police state along the border. It's absolutely incredible.
Yeah, and the progressives need to understand that the single most efficient thing U.S. policy could do to help the poor of the world is to end immigration controls. Because when people come from poor areas, poor countries, and by that, to be specific, we mean, among other things, those countries are capital poor. There aren't a lot of modern machines and computers and all the things that make human labor, which by itself is not very productive, make it very productive. If you bring somebody from a capital poor area to a capital rich area, that person very soon becomes, it's orders of magnitude more productive than he or she was back at home. And that means they're not only able to make more for themselves and their families, a lot of, the wealth by the way, they send home to parents and other family, but it makes them more able to achieve a better life for them and their families, but they're also providing more trading opportunities for the people around them. So they're benefiting too, and they're forming businesses if there aren't barriers. If you really want to, if you care about the poor of the world, and it seems to me you don't want to say I only care about the poor of America. That sounds sort of chauvinistic and tribalist. I don't know a good progressive would want to say that openly. But if you care about the poor of the world, as Brian Kaplan likes to point out, the best thing to do then is to get rid of all the immigration restrictions.
Yeah, and let me shift gears a little bit to another subject that you've written this great book on for the Future of Freedom Foundation, Separating School and State, How to Liberate America's Families. I mean, this is, I think, one of the major demarcation points between liberals and progressives and libertarians is that they believe in this system of public government schooling where people are mandated to subject their kids to an education by the state. It used to be that everybody had to go to either a public or a government-approved private school, and it's only relatively recently that they would permit people to homeschool, but still mostly under government auspices. And, of course, it's the same kind of system that exists in every country, Cuba, North Korea, China, Russia, and so forth. Well, what do we libertarians advocate? As you said in your book, a separation of school and state, a total free market in education, in which the government plays no role whatsoever. And we believe not only is this consistent with freedom, but that it actually is the key to a higher, better education for everyone, especially those at the bottom of the economic ladder. What do you think, Sheldon?
Well, conservatives like to sound like they're not so staunchly pro-government education. They support, what I regard as gimmicks, called, like vouchers or charter schools or tuition tax credits. We've critiqued that in the past, pointing out that that's not a free market, that doesn't introduce entrepreneurship, because if the money's still coming from the government, it's going to include conditions and new grounds for regulation. And so, I don't believe that's going to get us where you and I want to go. So conservatives like to sound that way, but in the end, they don't really oppose government schools, even if they want to inject a little sort of synthetic competition into the system. They still believe ultimately, in the legal sense, the government is the parent. There is an old doctrine, parens patriae, which holds that as a last resort, the state is the parent, and so they want the government inculcate. They may not like who's running the public schools these days, for the most part, or certainly at the Department of Education level in Washington, but they do want the schools to inculcate patriotism, right, and love of Constitution, all the things they say they value. They want the state to do that. They just don't like it when people they disagree with are in charge. I mean, they would put religion back in the schools and back in the government schools if they could. You often hear that talked about. So they're not with us on the education question no more than the progressives are, who who don't even really like private education. They insist, they really do believe if it's not being sponsored by government, it's not really any good. It's not education. They think government should be doing it. And it's, in a way, they're not that far from the conservatives.
Yeah, I mean, I love your concept of the parent. You know, I've said before sometimes that people look at the government as their daddy, and that we don't elect a president, we elect a daddy, that he's going to watch over us and take care of us and provide us our food and educate our children and keep us safe from the very terrorism and other dangers that many times they themselves produce. Which sort of is a segue into our, maybe in the limited time left, is the big one, and that's the warfare state, where the liberals and conservatives love the fact of big government, big daddy, in terms of a big standing military bases all over the world, invasions, occupations, torture, rendition, kidnappings. They love this stuff. And they love the whole concept of the national security state, which they said was necessary to fight the Cold War against their own World War II ally, the Soviet Union. And then the Cold War ends, and it was like we libertarians long predicted. They weren't going to dismantle this edifice because they love it. They love the concept of a big imperialist state. And it's really just a big racket, as General Smedley Butler pointed out. But, you know, in a different sense, in the modern sense, they go abroad, the CIA and the military does, with their interventionism. They produce the anger and the hatred, and which generates the terrorist threat, which then the NSA uses to spy on Americans and keep this massive surveillance scheme intact. Really, the only solution to this is what we libertarians have said. The only thing consistent with a free society and a prosperous society is a dismantling of this entire edifice, the welfare state, the warfare state, and that's the key to the future of this country, Sheldon.
Yeah. And we need to be careful that the people on the Obama side of things on the surface can look different from the conservatives on this issue, because they talk about humanitarian intervention, like in Libya and like what they're talking about in Syria, where they'll use the prospect of civilian casualties as a reason for the U.S. government to intervene. But we shouldn't be fooled by this distinction. That's a cover. There are the same old geopolitical considerations going on there, because, there are places that they don't call for humanitarian intervention. So, why one place and not another? It's usually because of geopolitical considerations. So, they're a little trickier. The so-called liberals and progressives are a little trickier on this. People like Susan Rice, who's going to be Obama's national security advisor, and somebody like Hillary Clinton, who may well be running for president. We should point out that their program of humanitarian intervention is really essentially the same as the conservatives' just outright empire, and we shouldn't be fooled by this little gloss they give it that this is being done for poor civilians, when the people they are aiding, the people they're arming, have been pretty brutal too. Like in the case of Syria. I don't mean to say anything nice about Syrian leader Assad when I say that a lot of people on the rebel side have been vicious in terms of beheadings and things of that nature, and those are the people that are getting the American guns. So we should beware humanitarian intervention, just like we beware all other intervention.
Yeah, good point. And which sort of brings us back full circle to the beginning. I mean, the humanitarian interventionism, it seems to me, is just a form of welfare. It's a deadly form of welfare, where they're doing a cost benefit analysis and saying, hey, let's go in there and kill any number of people, because there's never an upper limit on it, in order to bring freedom and democracy to the survivors. And I think the Iraq War was a good example of, once they didn't find those infamous and scary WMDs, that I think was just a sham and a pretense for the invasion, that they turned to this humanitarian thing of, we're really just here to bring freedom to the Iraqi people. What a crock. They loved them to death, in other words. But anyway, I think that's the end of the show, Sheldon. We've run out of time, unfortunately. Greatly enjoyed the exchange, and I hope you all enjoyed the show. That's the Libertarian Angle for this week, and we'll see you next week.